You have been talking over the last couple of days about this new research you've done on voter registration since Kamala Harris became the VP. Your site, Target Early, gives us unparalleled looks into the early vote. Talk a little bit about two things, right? One is why this kind of data matters in our understanding of the election, and then also what you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, why it matters is pretty simple. It's like we have this sort of asymmetrical approach to understanding the electorate, which is about 95% of our understanding of the electorate. And I'm talking about like the public domain, not sort of behind the scenes, but it comes from polling. And that's generally just because that's what people have access to and that's what people are used to. And as we all know, as y'all have talked about, quite effectively, what polling sort of misses out on is the most important question of all, which is who's going to vote, where the intensity lies, which groups are peaking and surging in terms of interest and which groups just aren't that excited about how things are going. And so polling it generally lags a cycle behind, right? Like you look at the likely voter models in these polls now that we're all consuming, and they're generally based on some sense of let's take what happened in 2020 in terms of turnout for each group and let's adjust for some population changes and throw it out there. And that's fine as a relatively transparent metric, but what we know is that it's very rare when you have two consecutive presidential elections or midterm elections where that actually happens. And so what we're trying to do with the registration data, or what we're actually doing, is we're looking into who, in terms of these different groups, looking at age, race, gender, ethnicity, education, all these important elements of political decision making, who are actually standing up and taking the actions that are actually indicative of being engaged in this election. And so new voter registration has historically been the best indicator of that. And there's still noise you have to sort through there, right? Like a lot of states have automatic voter registration. And so we're not even so much looking at the raw overall numbers. We're looking at peaks and valleys in those numbers. So automatic voter registration wouldn't explain why 70% of new registered voters in the lead up to the Kansas post Dobbs election were women, right? That wasn't automatic voter registration. That was overwhelmingly young women coming out and saying, no, I have to vote in this election. And then they actually participate and they turn out at a higher rate than all men. It's that sort of thing.
The Taylor Swift bump?
Exactly. Well, so that's the cool thing to me about this analysis is like what we've been looking at. There's really like a few periods in time. And like even if you were in like some sort of deep sleep during the last few months and you went back and looked at the data, what you would say is, okay, something really big happened after July 21st because huge spike. Something big happened in late August. Something big happened in early September. And those something big were, as we know, the President Biden withdrawing from the race and endorsing the vice president, the Democratic convention, the presidential debate, followed by the Taylor Swift, Instagram post endorsement, vote.gov link sharing. You see these amazing spikes. And so it's not symmetrical. Again, in these cases, the increases have been coming overwhelmingly from women, from young voters, and from voters of color. And so, like young women of color, you're seeing numbers, registration numbers, where they're literally tripling, in some cases, more than tripling their registration rates during these time periods. And so, for me, it's meaningful for two reasons. It's just more voters who are likely to vote for the vice president, to state the obvious, is helpful to the vice president's campaign, but also perhaps more impactful just in terms of raw numbers and the ability to impact the outcome of this election. That would suggest that these groups overall, not just new registrants, but those who have been registered for a while, but maybe they registered after the Dobbs decision in 2022, maybe even before that, and they were considered lower propensity voters who are less likely to vote. Well, this would suggest that those groups are going to have higher turnout come November. So that's why the analysis is interesting to me. And there's a reason to believe that that's not reflected in the polling because of the sort of cautious approach that I mentioned a minute ago.
Can we talk about early vote? Because now people are voting. Can you talk about how many folks have voted already? And if we're seeing sort of similar trend lines or record breaking numbers in specific states related to early vote yet, or if it's just too early to tell?
It's early, but you're talking about many millions of votes. I don't know where we're at today.
It's just over 7 million, but we're recording on
Perfect.
Thursday.
Yeah, it's a lot of people voting. It's probably in the end only maybe 10% of the total early votes we are going to see have come out so far. But the early signs, a lot of people are talking about Georgia, rightfully so. They kicked off early voting this week. And first 2 days of early in person, they had record breaking turnout. So, like, the easiest conclusion we can draw from that is that there's a high level of engagement. I think we anticipated that, but it's a reminder that if you think back to a few months ago where we weren't headed towards a very high turnout scenario. Voters in general just weren't very excited about the idea of a rematch. I believe that would have changed, and at this point you would have seen higher intensity, but likely not anywhere near what we're seeing now. So check one box there. Is like voters are engaged. You're seeing high turnout in some of these states, especially from older voters. The early electorate is much older this time around than it was in 2020. That doesn't mean that young voters are not engaged and enthusiastic. What we expected to see happen is a lot of voters are going to pivot from voting early in 2020, when the pandemic was a big deal, to voting on election day this year. And that'll overwhelmingly be younger voters. We saw that in the NBC poll that was released not that long ago. So, yeah, I mean, those are some big takeaways. In Michigan, one of the things that was interesting to me was seeing huge turnout among Black voters, especially older Black women, especially in Detroit. Certainly a good sign for the vice president's campaign. But you are seeing Republicans turn out early at a higher rate than they did 4 years ago. Again, we expected this. Donald Trump convinced, somewhat bizarrely, his supporters that voting by mail was fraudulent 4 years ago. And you saw lots of Republicans come out after the fact and say, what a mistake that was. That hurt us. Some claimed that cost them the election. And so they've put a lot of effort and energy into changing that. Frankly, the shifts we're seeing, though they're real, I almost expected to see bigger shifts because of all the talk that they've engaged in over the last few years about how they're going to change it. I think maybe we're seeing the cost of them not having a real campaign. I'm not saying they don't have a campaign at all, but as we know, the sort of investment in the party infrastructure that's happened on the Democratic side, you think of the robust state party environment. Whereas on the Republican side, they've sort of bankrupted that infrastructure so they can pay off Donald Trump's lawyers. It's possible we're seeing the effect of that now. Again, it's early. In the next week or so, we'll get more data in, certainly to the point where we'll have a little more confidence. But that's what we're seeing, at least at this early phase.
I was just going to say, I just read this morning, I read a Substack by a Republican digital strategist called Doom Scroll. It's sort of like the Republican version of For What It's Worth that we write at Courier. And she was actually lamenting how she wasn't seeing pretty much any GOTV ads or engagement from Republican campaigns online in particular. And Democrats are outspending Republicans hugely just on get out the vote, mobilization messaging, and infrastructure. I think that it looks like from the numbers in terms of ad spends that the Trump campaign is sort of relying on the super PACs that Elon Musk is heavily funding to take care of their turnout, which is interesting because he doesn't have a lot of electoral or political or voter engagement experience. But I just wanted to echo that even a Republican strategist was suggesting that they just didn't have the turnout game or infrastructure that Democrats are approving.
Well, and Tom and I were talking earlier today about how Republicans spin everything, right? And there's no spinning right now that the early vote is going well for them. There's just nobody saying that on their side, which is a sign that they don't think it's actually going well for them. And just to put an exclamation point on something Tom said, it was sort of our belief, he and I did all this early vote analysis 2 years ago in the midterms. It was our belief that it was likely that we would see Republicans to be doing better than 2020 in this election because of them now trying harder, right, with in the early vote. And also because some of our younger Democrats are going to be voting as independents because we've seen a big increase of young people registering as independents. So some of our vote was actually going to live over in the independent column. So it would make it look like we've lost Democrats, right? So we expected, and Tom did a whole briefing for the campaign 2 weeks ago, letting them know that the likely data would be that we'd be underneath 2020. And some people could argue that there was intensity problems on the Democratic side. The truth is we're above 2020 right now nationally, and we're way above 2020 in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, which is not what we expected. And so right now, I think there's far more evidence, as both of you have been saying, that the Democratic coalition is bringing intensity, and our superior organization is moving people to go vote in a far more effective way than they are, which is why I think, Tara, going back to the whole premise of this show, right, is that there's evidence that we're closing stronger than they are in the early vote, and people should be encouraged, but we still have a lot of work to do.
As y'all know, like pushing, chasing, getting the early vote out, it is very labor intensive. And to your point, Tara, it's like, it's not something that if you haven't done it before, you can just kind of pick it up. And so Republicans have spent years telling their side that it's fraudulent, that ballot harvesting is some type of crime. And now to try to pivot at the last moment when they've spent so much time convincing their supporters otherwise, sort of two things happening. Like they're victims of their own propaganda campaign potentially, and they're also victims of just not having that sort of campaign operation. Whereas you see the early data in these states where we have invested, again, looking at North Carolina will be an interesting state to watch for a lot of reasons, but the early vote there obviously got started later because of court challenges and because of the storm. Early results we're seeing there are looking good as well, where Democrats are outperforming there as well. So another one I'm looking at. But yeah, again, let's check in next week on this, but it looks like Republicans are reaping what they've sown over the last few years at this point.
Yeah, to steal a line of Simon's, we're winning, but we haven't won yet. So we can't rest on any laurels for sure. But I can't help myself on this point because I got into a lot of arguments with strategists on the Democratic side early on in the campaign before Harris became the nominee, where they were really counting on a low turnout election. And to me, that was always crazy. I think there was a little bit of hope for a lower turnout election amongst some Democratic strategists that won't be named because they were so worried about the lack of enthusiasm that I understood. And it was real to some degree, but I shared your belief, Tom, that it at this stage in the race, even if Biden had been at the top of the ticket, more folks would have been more engaged. But the other thing I want to remind folks of is that in 2020, Dobbs had not happened. Roe v. Wade had not been overturned. The January 6th insurrection hadn't happened, which I do believe peeled some Republicans and Trump supporters away from him because of the inciting of political violence and just utter disdain and disrespect for our government and our democracy. And so, we've all entered this not knowing what was going to happen. So I personally am not that actually surprised. Again, not resting on any laurels, but we're in a very different country today than we were in 2020 in many, many, many ways. And I think that women in particular have shown up every single election and opportunity they've had since the Dobbs decision by the Supreme Court to vote as a referendum against the MAGA agenda. And I think that we are going to see that again. And we already are in the early numbers, which is really exciting.
And it's why Democrats have outperformed polls consistently since Dobbs, right? It's the same cautious approach that I was referring to a minute ago in terms of the pollster assumptions. Let's look at what happened in 2020 as a baseline and then sort of adjust for population changes. Again, that's pretty cautious, but the data for the past 2 years overwhelmingly suggests otherwise, to your point, that we will see higher turnout from women, especially younger women. And so to see that materializing into voter registration data would support that. And, again, the whole story won't be written to state the obvious until election day. The one caution that I would offer that I think we would all share is that Democrats will go into election day needing a higher turnout from younger voters than we did in 2020 because of this shift away from the pandemic environment. So it just means more work to be done. But, obviously they have a campaign built around doing exactly that.
Thanks, Tom. It was great. Good to see you, brother. I'm just so grateful for your work. And Tara, I just want to acknowledge, as you and I have been in this thing for a long, I've been a little bit longer than you, but you've been in the weeds here in this business, that Target Early, this site that Tom's firm has made available to us publicly, they're doing this on their own dime. I mean, it's an incredible public utility. It helps Americans really get a better understanding of their own election. And so, Tom, just also as a proud patriot and fellow warrior in this thing, thank you guys for making this thing available. It's been really helpful.
Yeah, we love to do it.
And it looks like your campaign, Simon, to get everyone to vote on day one really turned up in Georgia. So thanks for that.
Well, can I tell you where it also turned?
300,000.
I know.
Yeah, you'll see it in Target Early. It's actually across the battlegrounds. It's actually amazing when you look at. You can look on the site at the super voters, the people who are sort of those people that vote fairly reliably, but maybe weren't voting early, and to see that turnout right from the beginning. Simon and I have talked about that. Like, well, I guess it worked.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, brother.
Thanks, y'all.